of everybody for joining us this evening. I will say a brief prayer and then we'll get started. Gracious God and Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to meet and discuss what it means to be a human being and what it means to age and to grow old. I pray that everything that is said and the questions that come will be helpful and edifying for all of us. It's in your name we pray. Amen. So this is going to be a high level sprint and summary of a book that relates to a PhD thesis I wrote a few years ago at the University of Edinburgh on entitled Chasing Methuselah. Some of us, or most of us, may identify Methuselah as a character in the Old Testament, the oldest lived human being, as recorded in one of the genealogies in Genesis. So those phrases are still around in culture, old as Methuselah, although it's taken a bit of an ironic twist now, as Methuselah now is being overtaken by those in science and technology as a goal for us today to greatly or significantly expand human life by actually slowing aging. We'll talk pretty quickly here in a minute about why aging versus other means of slowing down the human body. We're definitely living longer. Madame Jeanne Calment of Arles, France, lived to be 122 years old. She began fencing at age 85. She was still riding her bicycle when she was 100. And I love this one. She finally gave up cigarettes at 120, mainly because she no longer had the dexterity to light her own cigarettes, and she didn't want to ask help for that. At age 121, she released her first rap CD. I've not heard that, but well, that would be interesting. And when asked what her secret for longevity was, she said port wine and chocolate. Apparently, she consumed about 2 pounds a week. We have, over the last century, experienced a dramatic increase in the human lifespan. Currently, well, this is actually 2011 data. Life expectancies were roughly 81 and 76 for females and males, respectively, for those born at the turn of the century. That is quite a difference from the life expectancies in 1900, which were around 150 years. Most of these gains, however, have come from a reduction in the infant mortality rate, the effective treatment of acute illnesses like tuberculosis and smallpox, and improved general sanitation and hygienic practices. You could also put more economical and efficient farming methods in there as well, though we still have a problem in our world. But are we necessarily healthier? What we've also seen, particularly over the last several decades, is that these longer lifespans we're experiencing are now revealing conditions that are becoming much more common, namely Alzheimer's, which is a form of dementia, and heart disease. Several scientists and scholars have pointed out that we are on the verge of what's been called a mass geriatric society. Those who are 85 and older represent the fastest growing segment. This is from the census data back in 2010, which has tracked over the last 110 years the population of those who are 65 and older. And so back at the turn of the last century, or 2 centuries ago, to 1900, there's on the left here you can see the scale of millions of individuals, but we had roughly 4.5% of the population would be 65 and above, but you can see there was a slight dip in 2000, but in 2010 that's up over 12% of our population is 65 and above, and that number will likely increase when the 2020 census is published. This increase in longevity is, it's no secret, continues to put tremendous amounts of stress on healthcare in the United States. The number of Americans with Alzheimer's is expected to rise from 4 million to nearly 14 million just in the next 30 years. Alzheimer's and other dementias rather cost Medicare and Medicaid $206 billion last year, and the estimated cost for Alzheimer's alone is projected to be at about $584 billion by 2050. So these are troubling trends, and they are crippling our healthcare system. The President's Council on Bioethics studied the impact of growing old back in 2005 under President Bush. At this time, this was actually an eclectic bunch of scholars and philosophers and researchers, some Christian, some Jewish, some who were atheist and agnostics, and President Bush wanted to create a kind of think tank for people to get together and publish some data and to help us reason through some of these thorny issues. Once Bush left office, we've not had anything like it since. But in a book entitled "Taking Care" that was released by the President's Council, they pointed out that with these longer lifespans, we are also seeing an increased likelihood of a prolonged decline. And so for most of us, we can expect to experience roughly 2 years of significant disability before death, unless another catastrophic event takes us out, either in the prime of life or later in life. But the most common illness trajectory right now is a slow decline. So these are fairly rough categories, but this typical chronic illness trajectory dealing with cancer would look something like this. This roughly accounts for 20% of all deaths, where health is considered, or health is rather stable. But then an event like cancer can bring a rather quick decline that ends in death. There are another chronic illness trajectory looks something like this. This accounts for another 20% of the total, where you have a slow decline punctuated by some dips of some specific events that may require hospitalization or special forms of care, where there will be some recovery, but it will not be to the level that an individual, the health level will not be to that which the individual experienced before some of these events. Here they typically speak mostly of heart and lung failure. This might be a typical trajectory for COPD, although I don't believe they list specific conditions, at least on these graphs. And then the other 40%, I know there's 20% missing, and I'm not sure if they could characterize the other 20%, but 40%, the biggest percentage, entails this kind of slow decline, increasing frailty, physiological decline, and some form of dementia. This won't be all of us, but this indeed is an inevitable byproduct for many of us for aging. And this this is going to continue to stress our healthcare system. So back again to the President's Council, they noted the defining character of our time seems to be that we are both younger longer and older longer. We are now more vigorous at ages that once seemed very old, and we are far more likely to suffer protracted periods of age-related disability and dependence because we live to ages that few people reached in the past. And I think that's a great summary of where we are today, even though this was already 15 years old. They also point out that if we were to cure all forms of cancer, we would likely increase the maximum overall lifespan by roughly 2 to 3 years. Therefore, most have concluded that any kind of substantial increase in the maximum lifespan could only be achieved by slowing down the human aging process. But it's also recognized that if there is a way to extend the healthy lifespan and also compress this period of decline and morbidity so that we live longer and die more quickly, we stand to significantly ease the burden of our healthcare system. Longevity Dividend Initiative Consortium. LDIC has already been taken, but anyway, they're going to use that acronym anyway. In this consortium, again, it's a collection of gerontologists, social scientists, economists, other physicians, those in geriatric medicine. There's some basic tenets that this consortium has made. Some observations I think that do make some sense. Aging has emerged as the primary risk factor for the most common fatal and disabling diseases. Sooner or later, the gradual deterioration and breakdown of our body leads to the incidence of diseases that are age-related. The longer we live, the greater the influence aging has on how diseases and when and how often they're expressed. So aging science is potentially far more effective a weapon for presenting disease and preventing disease and extending healthy life. Therefore, these scientists are arguing for a new paradigm of prevention in public health. This is S.J. Olshansky, one of the leading researchers of this group. He has said that research in the scientific study of aging has already showed that the aging of our bodies is inherently modifiable, and that a therapeutic intervention that slows aging in people is a plausible target in public health. Given the speed with which population aging is progressing and chronic, fatal, and disabling conditions are challenging healthcare costs across the globe, the case is now being made in scientific literature that delayed aging could be one of the most efficient and promising ways to combat disease, extend healthy life, compress morbidity, and reduce healthcare costs. And Olshansky would be one of the first to criticize methods of slowing aging that aren't backed by sufficient science. When he was writing about slowing aging roughly 20 years ago, he was, I think, noticeably far more skeptical. But given some of the scientific breakthroughs that we'll talk about very shortly, he has become more optimistic. And in fact, he said elsewhere, it's only a matter of time before aging science acquires the same level of prestige and confidence that medicine and public health now enjoy. And when that time comes, a new era in human health will emerge. when he was first writing back in 2001 and 2002, this field of gerontology was still in its infancy, and scientists working on aging were having trouble being taken seriously. Gerontology. What is gerontology? It is the study of aging. Geron is the Greek word for old or aged or old person. Gerontologists are not studying what it means to grow old and the diseases associated with growing old, but they're looking at the human aging process itself. There are a few scenarios out there, and sometimes it's difficult to keep them all straight. So one of the more common scenarios is to compress, as I mentioned earlier, this period of decline by slowing aging. The idea here is to live longer and to die quickly. This may lead to a little bit longer health span, but the overall lifespan may or may not increase. This has been termed as adding life to one's years, which relates to the second point. This compression may or may not extend life beyond current biological limits. There are some gerontologists who are saying not only can we slow down the human aging process, but we should be able to, by doing so, push like the Madame Jeanne Calment scenario of 120 years. That ought to become more the norm. In fact, maybe we can go even beyond this by a decade or two. And in the extreme camp, there are a group of philosophers and scientists known as transhumanists who are committed to using technology to leave human nature behind and to make us better than human. So Aubrey de Grey is probably one of the more well-known transhumanists, and he firmly believes that the science is progressing rapidly enough that there's an individual alive today who may live hundreds of years, simply because we will, in the next 20 or 30 years, have enough technology to push out the lifespan by 30 or 40 years, which gives scientists, presumably because they'd be taking this, more time to try and develop even more advanced techniques, so that there may be some person whose lifespan is radically longer, say a tenfold longer than 100 years. He has plenty of skeptics on that, but he also has plenty of followers. He's developed this SENS acronym, which stands for negligible senescence, which is just senescence is just a more technical term for aging. There have been successes in the laboratory. Nematode worms, they're not terribly complicated creatures. The life of nematode worms has been extended through just manipulating a couple of genes, and they show that they're healthy. Michael Rose has bred fruit flies to live several times longer than normal fruit flies, and what he does there is he allows he's drawing on some theories of evolution in only allowing flies that are born later in the mother's gestation period to survive, and then allowing those to breed and continuing the process. And through this, he has actually 12th generation fruit flies that live 3 to 4 times longer than normal flies. He's also shown that if you refrigerate them, they live longer, though I'm not sure how practical that would be, or whether we'd all like to live in a cooler climate, but there is something to being exposed to cooler temperatures. Just quickly, back to the nematode worms, the DAF2 and DAF16 alterations of these genes have doubled the healthy lifespan of these worms. There are other mutations that have produced a 7-fold increase in nematodes in healthy life, so that their lifespan, which is roughly 31 days, has been pushed out to 200 days. There's some promise with telomerase therapy. That's a tongue twister. Telomeres are the unencoded scripts or tips of the strands of DNA, and when you have cell replication over time, these tips become frayed and cells stop dividing. All somatic or bodily cells eventually stop dividing. So with this enzyme, scientists have been able to surpass normal limits for cell division. One key issue here, however, is that if it's too effective, these cells never stop replicating, which is precisely what cancers do. So there is a connection there. Probably the most promising, however, is caloric restriction mimetics, which is basically a host of technologies that seizes on the benefits of subsisting on a reduced diet. So CR, or caloric restriction, has been around for a while. This link was discovered by Clive McKay in the 30s. I say discovered because the church fathers seem to know something about fasting and longevity, and we'll get into that in a minute. But there's studies that have shown, and it's been proven, that if you feed mice 30 to 50% less than other mice who are allowed to eat whenever they want, they live 30% longer on average. Less food, less oxidative stress on the body, less DNA repair. Dr. Guarente at MIT has discovered a gene that can be expressed that mimics caloric restriction. It's called the SIR2, or silent information regulator gene. A couple more things about CR mimetics. Life has been increased by 70% by using a combination of caloric restriction and genetic engineering. And so the search is on for a Methuselah pill that will mimic the effects of caloric restriction without having to alter our diets. This is certainly this has led to a spate of books, although there's never been a shortage of books about how to live longer. There's the Telomere Diet and Cookbook, the Immortality Edge, Longevity Diet, the 120-year diet. I guess my only response to that would be along the lines of Woody Allen, who said something along the lines of, if you had to live and eat off this kind of diet to live 120 years, it's probably not worth it. Diets that make you feel as if you live longer than you actually have might be kind of problematic. There are still more recent developments. I won't spend too much time on this. CR restriction there have been benefits that mimic caloric restriction in a chemical known as rapamycin that was discovered on Easter Island a few years ago. Currently, Novartis Pharmaceuticals is working with an mTOR inhibitor. They've entitled it RAD-001. It shows promise of mimicking the effects of a significantly reduced calorie intake without actually having to go into a kind of extreme form of dieting. Metformin it's already on the market. There has been a study released, or there's a study going on right now, of more than 41,000 metformin users between the ages of 68 and 81. And they've already showed a reduced likelihood of dementia, cardiovascular disease, cancer, frailty, and depression. In fact, there was a group study of frail subjects who took metformin over the course of 9 years. and they showed a reduction in dementia, depression, and all of these other things I just mentioned. But they were shocked to see that a recent study of healthy volunteers showed that the age of the blood cells, as measured by particular forms of DNA methylation, which is a complicated way of measuring how cells function and age, the age of these blood cells actually was reversed within 1 week of a single 800 milligram dose of metformin. Closely related to this is senolytics, which is a new form of clearing up dead cells that are supposed to die once they stop dividing. Senolytics is aiming at cleaning up this process. And they've had great success with this in laboratory mice, and the push is on to try this in human beings. D&Q, dastanib and quercetin. Dastanib is a common chemo drug, and quercetin is a molecule found in capers, kale, and red onions. There is currently a human study with these on longevity. It was given to 14 patients with mild to severe idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. They received D&Q orally for 3 days a week for 3 weeks, and they all showed a statistically significant and clinically meaningful improvement. And then, sorry, this is the last one of all this kind of technical detail. For 1 year, there were 9 men who took 2 growth hormone medications in conjunction with metformin, which is a powerful caloric restriction mimetic that's used in mice. Geneticist Steve Horvath, one of several designers of this study at UCLA, expressed his surprise when he saw the improvement as measured by these. I expected to see slowing down of these clocks, but not a reversal. And according to their measurements, the participants on average took about 2.5 years off their biological ages. So this conceptual distance between aging and disease, while it continues to shrink, we find with developments like this, it becomes increasingly difficult not to see aging itself as a disease. Some, in fact, have decided that have coined a new term, gerontologophobia. That will never catch on. It's way too many syllables. But it's this idea that we're afraid to see what these gains might give us. But the body is seen as our adversary, and I think as Christians, this is problematic. Walter Longo, whose book was up on a slide a few slides ago. He's a professor of gerontology and the director of the Longevity Institute at UCLA and the Leonard Davis School of Gerontology. In his most recent work, he has described the body as an army of cells at war. David Sinclair is an Australian biologist, professor of genetics, and co-director of the Paul Glenn Center for Biology of Aging at Harvard Medical School. He said, accepting our biological limitations is unnatural. So aging for Walter Longo and David Sinclair and most of these researchers is just, in their minds, it's a disease, even though it does not yet have this formal classification. In a very candid moment in his book entitled Lifespan, Sinclair said this: spend a day in a nursing home like my wife does every few days. Go feed people who can't chew. Wipe their bottoms, bathe them with a sponge, watch as they struggle to remember where they are and who they are. And when you are done, I think you will agree that it would be negligent what you can to combat your own age-related deterioration. That's a somewhat haunting statement. So how are Christians to think about human aging and slowing it? I'm tempted just to stop the presentation right here and then just let you all just hear what you all have to say. I've got a few more slides, and I'm probably going to have to pick up the pace here a little bit. But this is basically the question that I've taken up in the book. It's interesting to note that the modern quest for slowing down human aging can be traced in part to Francis Bacon, who in his many works argued that we need to refine science. And specifically, we need to pursue instrumental or useful knowledge, like the how questions, and we need to give up on these deeper conceptual questions, like the what questions. So he, in particular, saw that we live in a fallen world, and he considered aging itself and slowing it as the most noble goal of medicine. And he couched his program in language, in biblical language. He, in very specific terms, said that science will enable us to regain Eden and restore our sovereignty and power over nature, the sovereignty and power that Adam had before the fall, or prelapsarian existence. Very briefly, and I added this slide earlier today. Just for those who are curious, Aristotle said that if we're going to study the natural world, we need to know these four causes. Like, what's it made of? How does it act, or how is it acted upon? What's its essence? What makes it the thing that it is? And what is its purpose? This is precisely what Bacon didn't like. And so in his program, if you want to go after formal and final causes, that just bogs down science. We need to get rid of those kinds of questions and push that off into another realm. He said to seek the essence and the purpose of things is to seek in knowledge a couch, rather than using knowledge to build a rich storehouse for the glory of the Creator and the relief of man's estate. So this is his new scheme. And this two books idea, the book of the Bible and the book of nature, has long predated Bacon, but he decided that this would be the best way to divide things up. When it comes to the essence of things and what are things for, of course, let the Bible have its say. But when we talk about how A acts on B, or how plants grow, and what things are made of, what their cellular structure is, that is the realm of science. But science needs to get out of formal and final causes, because that just bogs everybody down. He was sharply critical of Aristotelian science. Here's a statement, just to let him speak in his own words. And therefore, it is not the pleasure of curiosity, like Aristotle, but it is a restitute reinvesting in great part of man to the sovereignty and power which he had in his first state of creation. It is a discovery of all operations and all possibility of operations, from immortality, if it were possible, to the meanest mechanical practice. So far as we're aware, Bacon firmly believed that when we uncover the mechanisms of the human body, we ought to be able to get back to Methuselah-like lifespans. But there's more to the story, and I don't want to be entirely critical of science as it's carried out today, which is largely along Baconian lines, just looking at how A causes B and what things are made up of. But there is a deeper and other theologians and thinkers have said, look, let's not be mistaken. This is a story or a narrative of salvation. Alan Verhey, in his wonderful little book Nature and Altering It, has said, in the myth of the Baconian project, nature is the enemy. nature may be and must be mastered. It may be and must be altered. In this myth, technology becomes the faithful savior. Gerald McKinney has written at length on this. He decries the Baconian project as basically a twofold goal. It's the elimination of suffering, whatever we define as suffering, and the expansion of choice. McKinney goes on and asks these interesting questions. The Baconian project, and the question is, what's the body for? He says the Baconian project not only replaces the attitudes and practices of the moral significance of the body, its pursuit of health and its susceptibility to disease, decay, and death, but is itself a set of attitudes and practices regarding the body, and one that is pervasive in our self-formation. And I think quickly some of those underlying assumptions are that the healthy body is a prerequisite to all other goods in life. I think that's it's not wrong to want a healthy body, but as we age, those expectations may have to be altered. Underlying this, too, is that our bodies are at best morally neutral. We are, in some ways, managers of our own biology. And the body and the soul are thought to have little to do with one another, though the question of the soul, that's a long and complicated question. So in looking at aging from a Christian perspective, I looked at how Bacon has kind of ushered in this modern quest. But if we go back further in church history, there is another narrative of a return to Eden that also involves slowing aging that is markedly different. So in my book, I contrast these two narratives and then ask the question, with the help of another thinker, what might using technology to slow our bodies down do to the relationship between our body and our soul and to God. So Eden in the desert. Athanasius was a bishop of North Africa, lived in Alexandria. He wrote a praiseworthy description of the life of St. Anthony, who fled to the North African desert, fasted for the remainder of his life, lived primarily as a hermit, though he did found some communities in the desert, but he also lived to 105 years old. He situated the life of Anthony in the biblical story. He himself believed and taught that Adam and Eve were created as finite beings simply because they were formed from the dust. But he also said that before Adam and Eve sinned, their souls were rightly controlling their bodies, and because their soul was rightly aligned and in fellowship with God. So the soul was in submission to God, the body was in submission to the soul, and that in this ideal or idling pre-sin state, the body ran more slowly. And so when we have sin coming on the scene, only when we have sin coming on the scene, which is described as a disruption of body and soul, do we see accelerated aging as a result. Athanasius also championed a form of salvation that's known as theosis, which is still very much celebrated and taught in the Orthodox Church, like capital O Orthodox Church. It's still regarded with some suspicion by Protestant theologians and ethicists, but I think there's some misunderstandings here. Drawing on 2 Peter, which we'll look at that text real quickly. Athanasius taught that when the Son of God, the Logos, the second person of the Trinity, came to earth and took on human flesh, as being born of the Virgin Mary and growing up as Jesus of Nazareth, he, by taking on human nature, has somehow restored humankind. It restores that divine image in us. How? Athanasius is a bit vague here, but he hints that when we engage in things like fasting, prayer, and the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist, that there is a genuine and real transformation with us that can also be bodily, where the image of Christ is more clearly formed in us, which allows us to participate in the divine nature. We don't become God. We don't lose our being in God. We always remain ourselves, but we become more like God. So Athanasius was not the first person to state this. This goes back at least 150 years earlier into to Origen and Irenaeus. But a summary of this theosis is Christ was made man that we might be made God. But that doesn't mean we ever replace God. In fact, that we can become God's little g is only because we are in relationship to the one God. 2 Peter chapter 1, his divine power has given us everything we need for a godly life through our knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and goodness. Through these he has given us his very great and precious promises, so that through them you may participate, koinonia, have fellowship in the divine nature, having escaped the corruption in the world caused by evil desires. So this doesn't come from nowhere. It's derived from Scripture. There's a couple of other texts that we could refer to, but in the interest of time, we need to keep moving. So Athanasius taught that Christ's incarnation involves a transformation of the flesh. This allows us to somehow slow down aging, particularly through the processes of fasting and prayer. However, this has its limits because we also, as Christians, look to the bodily resurrection. So there are these ethical aspects where fasting, as Athanasius and Anthony saw it, requires us to quiet our unruly or unruly desires, and that once we quiet those desires of the body, we are able to focus more closely and exclusively on our relationship to God. So there is an order to this moral formation. Peter Brown, I think, describes it just brilliantly when he says the ascetic had to learn over the long years of life in the desert to do nothing less than to untwist the very sinews of his private will. Fasting and heavy labor were important in their own right. So once the florid symptoms of greed and sexual longing associated with the ascetic's past habits had subsided, he was brought face to face with the baffling closedness of his own heart. It was to the heart and to the strange resilience of the private will that the great tradition of the spiritual guidance associated with the Desert Fathers directed its most searching attention. It was first and foremost about having Christ formed in us. So as a kind of summary here, fasting effected a return to Eden. It restored the body and soul to its rightful order. Aging attenuation was a byproduct of this. St. Anthony was presented as a model of this ethical theosis, and fasting was subsumed under, yet integral to, the refining of one's inner thought life. A couple of brief points that I don't have time to defend, but you're free to ask questions. Asceticism here was not motivated by a hatred of the body, though there are plenty of examples in the early church that we could cite that would indicate that there's something amiss. So asceticism here was not motivated by a hatred of the body, but I'm not saying it's not uncomplicated. It's a lot of negatives, isn't it? Character formation requires that we attend to the body. Fasting as a discipline helps keep them properly integrated in a kind of existential or phenomenal sense. The body and soul is also likened to two sides of a ladder by which I like this language, by which we ascend to humility. we are climbing up to become more humble. So the other side of this, and I'm almost done. About 12 more slides. So hang in there. in my book, I spend a lot of time looking at the first Adam and how the story of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden and the fall was told in the history of the Christian faith. But I also recognize that if I wanted to give any kind of Christian treatment of this as well, we also need to look to the last Adam. And admittedly, Athanasius does look at Christ, but he's focusing more on how these practices allow us to return to Eden. Barth takes us, a Swiss theologian in the 20th century. He focuses almost exclusively on the incarnate and crucified and killed and risen and ascended Christ. He had his own kind of he had the ground shift under his feet at some point in his life. I couldn't resist this quote. In growing up and being trained in the very liberal tradition, he says, in the Bible we do not find man's thoughts about the divine, but divine thoughts about man. Barth essentially said, if we want to know what it means to be a human being, we take our bearings first and foremost from the life of Jesus Christ as it presents us as presented to us in Scripture, right? Because we Christians confess that this Jesus Christ is fully God and also fully man, united without confusion in one person. If you ask how in the world that can be, the church has been trying to explain that ever since that was put in a creed. So for Barth, the real man Jesus is the ontological determination. What does that mean? It means the core, the foundation of what it means to be a human being. He also recognized, however, that it's not really easy to make a simple jump from the Jesus in the pages of Scripture to normative claims about what it means for us to be human beings. But he could say, and I think he's right, that we see that Jesus grew up and had a body and aged, and therefore it is good for us, on the one hand, to be creatures who age and have a limited existence. But on the other hand, Barth also insisted that if you go back to the garden story and the life of Jesus coming to rescue us, we have been from all eternity designed for fellowship with God who is eternal. So there's this tension of we're finite, but we are made for covenant fellowship with a God who is eternal. So on the one hand, our divine determination, this is Barth's language, as covenant partners with God, Barth would say, wouldn't that seem to mean that our lifespan should really be indefinite? On the other hand, he would say, but yet we have a Jesus who took on human flesh, is finite. So he could also say our life is both a gift and a task from the eternal God. And he could see this tension as a cause of discontent. Discontent for what? For the fact that we're limited creatures. So Barth himself acknowledges that we have within us this desire to live a long time or to live forever. I'm quoting him now out of his Church Dogmatics. He says, what but an unlimited permanent duration can be adequate for the fulfillment of this determination? So he himself is wrestling with this question. He would also say that the real man Jesus, as presented in the Bible, is both an embodied soul and an ensouled body. He's drawing on language in the New Testament. So he speaks of this as a Christian dualism insofar as he's willing to draw a distinction between the body and soul. But eerily similar to what Athanasius said of Adam in the garden before the fall, in Jesus Christ there is never disorder between body and soul and God. Jesus' soul is always in perfect subjection to and fellowship with God, and Jesus is always in full control of his body. So that's, I'm dumping a lot of heavy theology on you. And so I use Bart and his extended reflections on what it means to be a creature of time for us, what it means for us to have our own limited existence. This section that he talks about our finitude and time, and yet at the same time we're designed for this eternal fellowship, is it's like a 140-page section in the Dogmatics, and it's very rich. And I'm just going to pick out the highlights. He also is asking what it means for us to be sinners, and he's not going to let go of the fact that we live in a fallen world and we ourselves are fallen. So he's asking the question: what does it mean? What does it mean to be sinners in light of the lordship of the Son of Man, Jesus Christ? And he says, forms. It is sloth. I threw the German up there. It's probably not helpful. And sin is misery. I'm not going to talk about sin as misery, though it's just a wonderful section too. But and when he talks about sin as sloth, he's not talking about laziness, and that's a much deeper and richer term. But what he does is he analyzes. He looks at sin as sloth with respect to 4 aspects of the human life. In other words, how does sloth manifest itself in our relationship to God, which he says it makes us stupid? Isn't that refreshing? He says it manifests itself as our inhumanity in the way that we treat others. We are inhuman with our brothers and sisters, our human brothers and sisters, whether or not they are our brothers and sisters in Christ. And I'm not going to look at that either. I'm going to look at only 2 other aspects, and that is sin as sloth as it relates to the relationship between the body and soul, which is what Athanasius was talking about, and sin as sloth as it relates to anxiety. I am aiming to end this in like 8 minutes, so at least we'll have hopefully 15 minutes for questions. Interestingly, he says that when it comes to body and soul, as fallen creatures, we are in a state of disruption. In sloth, he says, now he's speaking kind of as a phenomenon, not metaphysically as our soul leaves our body, but he says in sloth, the body and soul begin to go their separate ways. The soul will no longer control his body, nor his body obey his soul. The two not only contradict one another in their mutual relationship, but also, refusing their distinct function in this relationship, contradict their own essence as the 2 integrated elements of human nature. If the dissipated man wills, as he does, to be without spirit, he has entered on the irresistible way on which he will finally be soulless and bodilyless, and that way it leads us only to death. So he says, either we relieve our soul of the responsibility of being our ruler and guardian and the preserver of our body, or we release our body from having to serve our souls and allow it to pursue its own impulses and needs. So I think he attaches strong sin language to this disorder, aging and spiritual health and sin together quite intimately. But then he looks at sin manifesting itself as sloth, as anxiety with respect to our limited span of time. Anxiety, he calls a disruption of our right relationship to the fact that we're finite creatures. And in this state, when we're anxious, our allotted duration, because God is still on the throne and determines the number of our days, our allotted duration becomes unbearable. And interestingly, he said it often takes the form of frenetic, ceaseless activity, including our scientific quest for longer life. But he points out that with respect to Zorge, or anxiety, that there is no infinite to satisfy our infinite desires except God. But this is something which the dissipated man who has broken loose from the unity and totality of soul and body, in which God has created him for existence in his limit of time, cannot grasp, but must endlessly repudiate in his own endless dissatisfaction, in what he takes to be his successful hunt for a cure for aging. He is himself the one who is hunted with terrible success by anxiety. He says, in sloth, we fret at the inevitable realization that our existence is limited. We try to arrest the foot which brings us constantly nearer to this frontier. So you start to, and his Christology, to critique some of the dangers of trying to slow down aging without condemning aging attenuation outright. I think this is a deeply ambivalent. I think this problem is suffused with some kind of ambivalence as Christians who look to the resurrection on the one hand, but can also acknowledge that life is a good gift from God. I'm not sure it's necessarily wrong to want a few more years of healthy life and to use technology to get that. There may be other qualifiers and caveats. So just a couple summary slides. My book is not an argument that fasting is somehow more a natural alternative to slowing aging via some kind of technology, caloric restriction mimetics or pharmacogenetics or genetic engineering. Much less is this an attempt to kind of demythologize the Desert Fathers' conception of aging attenuation. In other words, by saying, well, the Fathers thought that Christ was mysteriously involved in this process of slowing aging. Well, we know better. It was really that he just had a reduced diet. What I'm trying to do is construct some type of theological lens that we can use to critique anti-aging science. But I think in light of what Bart has said, I wonder if current attempts to manufacture a Methuselah pill might be described as the fruit of both trogheit or sloth, this disorder of body and soul. I think related to this is this deeper issue of the modern biomedical Baconian project that continues to minimize the moral significance of our bodies. I mean, we are largely, some bioethicists have said, we're largely managers. We view ourselves as managers of our own biology. Greater longevity just may be the byproduct. It might be the byproduct of fasting. But fasting may also allow us to become the kinds of people who are less concerned with the length of life. I mean, we could bring Bonhoeffer in here and cost of discipleship and maybe turn all of this on its head and say, well, maybe we're asking the wrong questions. Maybe we should be asking whether or not we're willing to die for the right kinds of things, and what a potentially longer life, how that might impact our ability to take risks. So I think slowing aging is still morally ambiguous. I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done. Certainly things I've not talked about are potential social outcomes. These are important. Environmental concerns, justice, accessibility, our perception of aged individuals in a culture where the cult of youth continues to gain force. Last slide, I promise. Fasting and spiritual formation, and then I'll take your questions or chats or comments. Wow, I see a lot. I hope this was reasonably clear. Douglas Burton Christie wrote Word in the Desert. He's talking about the desert ascetics. He said that the purpose of the monk's life in the desert was freedom. Freedom from anxiety about the future, freedom from the tyranny of haunting memories of the past, freedom from an attachment to the ego, which precluded intimacy with others and with God. They hoped also that this freedom would express itself in a positive sense. Freedom to love others, freedom to enjoy the presence of God, freedom to live in the innocence of a new paradise. Okay. Thank you. Um, thanks for, thanks for in enduring that uh, sprint through my book on aging. I've probably created more questions than answers, and I think that hopefully I think that's probably a good thing. So I
We
have
have some questions for you from the chat when you're ready.
yeah I think I'm I'm ready. Well, I'm not ready, but we're running out of time, so let's go ahead.
All right. So the first phone was, and I first used these people's names from the beginning, is when you were going through the slides with the different percentages, Debbie suggested that missing 20%, could that have been suicide, fatal accidents like car accidents, and alcohol, drug-related deaths?
Yeah, that's yes, and there's probably other scenarios I can't envision. Yeah, they would have to be accounted for somewhere, and the remaining 20% would be they would be included in that remaining 20%. I have no idea what those percentages would be, though.
Okay, and then we have a question from Les that says, how can healthcare costs be reduced by slowing aging? Even if we added 20 years to our lives, we would still hit a point where we would become weak, sick, and more prone to injury and illness,
Yep,
right?
yep, absolutely. Yeah, the what these practitioners and gerontologists are of the consortium are hoping for is not just the scenario that no one wants is, say, instead of having 3 or 4 years of decline after 65 or 75 years of life, having the same scenario at 85 or 95. Like there's no saving there. All the members of this consortium are committed to aging aging attenuation as a way of compressing the period of decline, so that the idea it's interesting. The idea is that you'd live to 95 or 97, and then at some point these technologies would fail, and you would frankly die more quickly. There's no evidence to suggest one way or the other that this scenario is achievable. It is certainly the goal, and it's desirable. But I think there's another danger. I think we can see how this, if we are one day able to just add 20 years of expected lifespan through technology, I think we can see how this might feed into physician-assisted suicide or euthanasia if at some point in the future life just is determined to be unlivable. So yeah, it's a great question. The hope is that the period of decline is significantly depressed because that's where all the money's going. It's also hard to see that scenario in the future as anything but a judgment on those who decide not to use this technology or may not have access to it and have to live in an extended care facility for several years. That's
Thank
all
you.
I've got for that one.
We have one more question from Debbie. From the perspective of eternity, more years on earth would mean fewer years in heaven, meaning less time in the presence of Christ himself. So is a longer life on earth really a good goal to pursue? And she also cites Job 14:5, which NIV is, a person's days are determined. You have decreed the number of his months and have set limits he cannot exceed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, there's complicated philosophical arguments about eternity and whether it can be even described in terms of time. One view would see it historically. There have been several theologians and philosophers who see eternity as timelessness. Yeah, I get the tension. But if life is also a gift, Paul in Philippians could fully recognize that, man, to live as Christ on this earth, but to die is gain. But then he immediately went on and said, even though I'm in this tension, it's better for me to be here among you. I know eternity will be wonderful, and I think its form of existence will be so amazing that I'm not sure I would have cared one way or the other if I lost a few years. I mean, if it's forever, and I believe it is, then I'm not sure the longer we're with the Lord, it would really matter. So I do take seriously the desire for longer, healthier life. If life is a gift from God, I don't think there's anything wrong with wanting that. The danger is when we make an idol of our lifespan, or the technologies that may help us eke out a few more years. Those are always complicated questions in terms of, especially if we're dealing with maladies, when to forego further treatment for the sake of quality of life, etc. And the Job comment, all I take that as is poetry, and it's true. Yeah, absolutely. God is God, and we have a limit. I think Job's bigger point is that God is on the throne, and if there are certain boundaries that we ought not to pass, God certainly won't allow it to happen. The big question is whether or not aging qualifies, or slowing down aging qualifies as one of those boundaries. And that I don't think we can answer that.
You have another question in the chat. Being that today was a beautiful and sunny 90 plus degrees in the Vegas desert, similar to that existence practiced by St. Anthony, would actively luxuriating in an unheated pool offset any ill effects of not living in a cooler climate?
Oh, that's good for you, Tyler. Yeah, I don't know. That's it might, and he's just trying to rub it in. We went. Tyler's my brother-in-law in Vegas, and we went to visit for spring break a month ago, and it was snowing when we saw him, and we were assured that never happens, but it did. Anyway, I'd say I say you should go to Lake Mead, Tyler, and just jump in it. Go jump in a lake. All right.
Would you like me to share the Taste of Seminary slide one more time if we don't have any more questions? Oh, we have more question.
Yeah.
Do you think we will see the Methuselah pill in our lifetime? From David.
No, I don't. I'm not that optimistic, but I do think the next generation, there will be some form of technology in the form of a pill that will be on the market. I think it's reasonable to say 30 to 50 years from now, maybe less, there will be something. Our grandkids may be faced with some of those issues. Well, great. Thank you. Thanks for your time and your attention and your questions and your comments. I will look through all of them, especially the comments that weren't questions. I always appreciate your feedback, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of the things I've been working on the last several years. So. Next week, you're welcome back. I think the same link is valid, if I'm correct. So it's 8:15 almost. So we never finish on time with anything. So I'm all for saying good night and respecting your time, and thanks for coming.